Yeah, hurry up.
Here's Diane.
Hello, welcome.
Hi.
We're going to give people probably a minute or so to join, to filter in.
Your volume.
Can we make this bigger or don't we need to?
So while we're giving folks another minute to filter on in, we decided that our check-in question, which we will invite you to respond to in the chat, our check-in question is, in a word or yes, in a short phrase, what would you say, what's the antonym for gentrification? What's the opposite of gentrification? So if you want to share your thoughts on that while we're letting people come in. And so I'm priming the pump there, but feel free to chime in on your with your own thoughts about what's the opposite of gentrification. And so as you feel moved, feel free to share in the chat what you think is the opposite of gentrification. And I think we'll move on, but feel free to keep sharing.
All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm experimenting with sharing the screen, so I apologize if it's a little clunky, but kind of before we begin, just wanted to share some upcoming ProDane events. We have the Outreach Committee coming up on Wednesday, March 10th, the Elections Committee on Saturday, March 20th, and the Policy Committee also on that day as well. And if you're looking to get more involved in some of the work we're doing, whether that be getting our candidates elected in the spring cycle or developing policy at the municipal level, these are great opportunities to get involved. And I will turn it over to Diane to introduce our panelists tonight.
Yeah, so we are really grateful to have 4 wonderful panelists who have different areas of expertise and focus regarding development and challenging gentrification. So I'm actually going to let our panelists just sort of briefly describe their themselves and their focus of work regarding development in the order that you see on that slide. So Rebecca Kemble, I'll invite you to go first.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Kemble. I'm Alder for District 18, which is on the north side of Madison, hemmed in by Lake Mendota and Cherokee Marsh and the town of Westport. So my interest in this topic has to do with, I mean, it's long term, and it's not just the result of my being in local politics, but it's the result of seeing, just especially for the last 40 years, decades of increasing inequality on all dimensions, and that inequality being highly racialized, to the point where, you know, just a statistic that keeps coming up to me is something that that Professor Revel Sims, who's with us now, in his study around Dane County evictions, came up with, and that was that single mothers are something like 6,000 times more vulnerable to eviction than others. And that is just totally unacceptable. And we need to figure out how to how to not let the market determine our lives, because the market is causing just this really unhealthy and destructive inequality. So that's where I come from. And my work in worker cooperatives has been trying to deal with that at the economic level, and now at the city level, I think we have some policy tools at our control to start dealing with it.
Great, thank you. And Olivia Williams.
Hi, happy to be here tonight. So I'm the Executive Director of Madison Area Community Land Trust, and I've been in the Community Land Trust world for about 6 years. I did my PhD research on Community Land Trust when I was studying urban geography, and I kind of entered that conversation out of concerns about gentrification.
Thank you. And Revel Sims.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Revel. As I was mentioned to some folks earlier, I'm from LA. I kind of got into academia through sort of the community perspective, in the sense that I was working with some community members at a place called Casa del Pueblo in LA. And we were watching gentrification unfold around us in a community called Echo Park. It's a predominantly Mexican community, sort of central part near downtown. And it just, we were trying to start a housing cooperative and totally failed. But you know, I was thinking that, hey, there's got to be a way to sort of document some of the concerns that folks were talking about, which is predominantly displacement. And that got me to thinking about that, and that's sort of what I do now. So I work with community groups, and fortunate to also be working with Tenant Resource Center, who, you know, through our relationship provides the data that I use to do some analysis with.
Excellent, thank you. And Kababa.
Kaba, you're muted.
Hello, sorry, I was muted. I'm Kababa. I wear multiple hats. My regular job is working for UW-Madison Space Science and Engineering Center. My background is applied physics and atmospheric science. I also do a lot of work within our community relating to housing. And this particular topic we're talking about here is very close to my heart. So I'm here wearing a hat under the umbrella of Save the Farm Coalition, which is a nonprofit organization that we have put together. I serve on that board. We're looking to acquire a huge 65-acre land off of Milwaukee Street to try to address this specific topic that we're talking about here, which is what is motivating us to put together efforts to acquire this. And I look forward to sharing
We
this
were
topic
just listening to speaker.
and others.
Great, thank you all. And Matthew's going to kick off the questions, but this is going to be a very interactive discussion. So Matthew and I are moderating, but we welcome any questions or comments anyone has either in the chat or if you raise your hand, we'll work it into the conversation.
All right, thank you so much. So kind of to kick things off, to our panelists, if you wanted to maybe just give like a brief explanation of what you perceive gentrification as being and kind of how you're seeing it manifest in Madison.
So Matthew, I don't know, do you want to go by names or identify whom you think might be the best to address a specific topic, or just want to open it up to the panel?
I think kind of just opening this up to the panel, and then kind of as we go through the conversation, maybe we could, direct specific conversations towards our panelists.
Okay.
I feel like I heard a good definition from Revel before.
I think first thing to understand about gentrification is really it's a process, and it's a differentiated process, something that looks different over time and looks different over different places. So unfortunately, we have this term, and it kind of brings together a lot of different things. And they while they may be related, I think they all are. I think we're watching fundamental sort of restructuring of cities and sort of how people are distributed. I think, on par with kind of, suburbanization to a certain extent, right? This sort of switching of people and place. But I think, the cause part of it is really the question. And there was a lot of attention, really early on gentrifiers themselves and, focusing on sort of their particular consumption patterns and tastes and who they are and all this stuff. And in my experience in like in LA, there's always, this is sort of what you experience kind of on the surface level, and there's a lot of antagonism at the community when sort of, community are experiencing stuff and it changes, and then they see the hipsters come in, and it's sort of shocking and disorienting and angering and all that stuff. But I think what's happening here now is a little bit different. I think it's really a process that is being led by sort of the lack of housing, structural lack of housing, lack of affordable housing in particular, and those things, and then the role that sort of cities and the real estate sector in particular, being one of the most dominant sectors of sort of capital in the cities today, are pushing, which is there's increase in security in tenure generally, and people are not, their amount that they're earning is going down relative to the rising housing costs. And I think that the real estate industry sees that as an opportunity for long-term revenue streams, because more people are becoming renters now than in the past. And so we're not the quote unquote ownership society. We saw that fall apart. And I think we will be increasingly a renter society. So the ability to own land and charge rents for people to live in urban cities is a really big opportunity for real estate capital. And I think that they're banking on the fact that there won't be lots of opportunities for people to find affordable housing that will be competitive. And so there is sort of a monopoly of powers that start to happen with people who control land and access to housing. So I think that's kind of what we're seeing here in Madison, is that it's really being pushed by real estate interests in conjunction with city and policy folks who think that just by producing housing, it's somehow going to make things affordable for everybody else. And the flip side of that is that the people come sort of after, it's like, it's not like the hipsters show up and then there's gentrification. It's real estate builds the places where, and it's not necessarily hipsters, but people with higher incomes and whatnot come in and they change the demographic profile of the neighborhood.
And I will chime in there from Revo. When we talk about gentrification, it's a loaded term. There are lots of things to look at, but overall in the big picture, it's by default what happens when you let capitalism take its natural course. As cities grow, as communities grow, it becomes a capital question. And when things happen following that path, in terms of real estate development, you end up with what is called gentrification. Um, Looking at a city like Madison, which is a prime city, very popular, very limited land space, particularly within the Isthmus, that's the natural trend that happens. It's not an exception what's happening to us. It's the norm in terms of capital when capital is in charge. Somebody asked, what is the opposite of gentrification? The opposite of gentrification is really balance. It's when you look at a situation and look at the whole picture to make sure that you're looking at things beyond capital. That is the opposite of gentrification to me. In this case of Madison, like I said, we are not an exception. It's what happens when you let capitalism take charge. People with money would buy prime real estate and develop it to attract prime return on investment. I am a licensed broker in the city of Madison for the past 11 years, and every single day I watch the market because I invest in it, and it's an area very close to my heart. Um, the best term for it is there's a song that says you pave paradise to put up a parking lot. If you want to understand gentrification, that's what you're looking at. It's financially driven. The developers don't have bad intentions. It is basically what brings them the best return. The politicians, on the other hand, are looking at what also creates more tax revenue so they can do more things, but in a short-term scale. But when you look at the big picture, it's bigger than that. Now, when you look at, for example, you put a list of the top best cities to live in America. Madison currently ranks number 21 on the USA News site. New York doesn't hit that list. Chicago doesn't hit that list. Las Vegas doesn't hit that list. Talking about Las Vegas, Reno, Nevada does. So gentrification is looking at things. When you look at quality of life, you're looking at the parks, biking, mom and dad shops, the birds that sing around the corner, the bees and the flowers. And these are things in a capital system that have very little value. And when gentrification takes over, it develops at the expense of that quality of life. And to me, that's what gentrification is.
Thank you. And I want to ask Representative Balde if he wants to ask his question.
Yeah, so thank you, Dan. So my question goes to Sims and Mr. Ba. So Kaba, you give a good, definition of what gentrification is. But I was just wondering, what are the signs of gentrification? What should the ordinary people look out for to feel like that this neighborhood is being in the process of gentrification? And if those signs are identified, what are the steps that they can take to prevent it? In response to that question, I'd also like you to give an example of maybe two places in the city of Madison that are either gentrified or in the process of being gentrified. The second question goes to Alder Campbell. You alluded to the fact that the city has some tools to deal with this. I would like you to go into detail about that. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Balde. Revel, do you want to start or do you want me to start?
Go ahead.
Okay. You mentioned, Mr. Balde, you mentioned two things. The first question I captured with what you asked is what are the signs of gentrification? And the second one relates to Madison in particular and which areas. Signs of gentrification is when you see rapid development and rapid changes in the demography of a location. What that means is you see rapid new buildings coming up, need for buildings that correlates to the demand, and the need of those buildings leads to a rapid change in demography. meaning that people with low income, single parents, people with minorities who can't afford, naturally cannot compete when you have so many new developments happening. Now, development can be good. This problem is too much growth is always cancerous. That's what cancer really is when you grow too fast. So the idea of growing itself is not the question. That is always welcome. Is when you grow too fast, it leads to what is called gentrification. In Madison, for example, when you mention, for example, where it's happening, a good way to look at Madison to understand where gentrification is to look at the policies and where incentives are for development. Taking, for example, right now, we've seen the past 5 years how the East Washington corridor just boomed. Developers are watching politicians and are studying the game. It's like a chess game. Okay, so city passes, TIF loans, and what do you call it again? Policies that makes it very easy to develop a place, and developers take a chance on that to respond in terms of meeting that need and make a profit. So in Madison, for example, a good example is the East-West corridor. A value of a property in East-West 10 years ago compared to today is probably doubled in some cases. I have noticed buildings that have sold this year at a price almost twice of what they were 10 years ago. So that's just an example. Again, it's not a bad thing to grow. It's when you grow too fast, it becomes cancerous, and that's what gentrification is to me.
Yeah, so let's see. Signs of gentrification, I think that's a really difficult one. I was partly alluding to that because I think that the way that we experience gentrification kind of on the ground level is not a really good indicator of sort of that process happening. So it may mean that for sure there's gentrification happening. And when you see I'm going to just keep on going with this example, but like the hipster, like I went back home to my neighborhood and this guy was selling succulents out of a coffee shop. And he was, I was like, what are you doing? This is LA. You can just pick up succulents out of everybody's yard. He's like, we're the succulent cooperative. And I'm just crazy. Anyway, something like that that's jarring, that just totally doesn't fit with the neighborhood, like the people. I think that messes things up. I would say the signs really are, first of all, proximity. So you need, this is proximity to city center. So part of what's driving gentrification is, being close, and that means close to spaces of value, spaces of recreation, and also very important for Madison, I would say, transportation. So transportation gives you access. Currently, there's a lot of attention on getting people out of their cars, which is not the same as providing transportation for people who don't have cars or are transportation dependent. Those are two different things. So that is sort of the policy, long-term planning around transportation, I would say, is really important for Madison. So to give an example, I would point to South Madison right now as a place that's vulnerable to gentrification because of long-term transportation planning. And that's important because of another issue you raised, which is identifying gentrification. And you kind of alluded to this in your comment, but you have to kind of distinguish between early gentrification and sort of more mature forms, because that's important for policy intervention. There's been a lot of work that given to try to identify what are the places that are vulnerable or at risk that are on their way to gentrifying that haven't gone there yet, because those are the places where you generally can do interventions, place-based interventions that might have some efficacy compared to, say, where it's a very mature form of gentrification where a lot of the demographic turnover, property owner turnover has happened. There's very little you can do in that context. So I think identifying sort of the stage of gentrification is really critical. So it doesn't look the same in all places. And from sort of interventionist, community-based approach, you want to be able to see where you can have the biggest impact. I will say the other thing that's really interesting about gentrification, and this is coming up now in some research, is the displacement aspect. I think that we tend to think of this thing as that there's gentrification happens and then displacement starts to take off. Actually, I think what we're seeing is that there's and this is why a lot of studies have difficulty quantifying the relationship between gentrification and displacement, is because a lot of the displacement happens prior to the gentrification process. So that happens for a number of reasons. Predominantly, I think it happens because landowners property owners are organizing themselves on some level, or sharing information, or have some sort of community-based information that they're working off of. And so this sort of displacement that we see prior to the gentrification process taking off is really critical, because that sort of, it's about power. And we're talking about how landlords play an active role in trying to sort of, redevelop or create value in their neighborhoods. In fact, there's been a number of studies that talk about how property owners of like rental property who don't live in that property have really high emotional commitment to that neighborhood, saying that they want to make the neighborhood better and all this stuff. And there's been a number of articles in, Cap Times about this. You can sort of see anecdotes of property owners who are like, I have a sort of social obligation to this area, regardless of whatever that may be, and how we might judge it. Certainly, they sort of see a heightened sense of power and status in shaping the trajectory of that neighborhood. So we see this. In fact, in LA, I saw this quite a bit, is that areas that were prior to gentrification, where you had the most displacement, and then the gentrification happens, and then the displacement actually starts to go down because there's significant effort by landlords to reshape the neighborhood, and then this reshaping happens, and then a lot of the displacement has already occurred. So there's sort of, that's the importance of getting in early, right? To be able to deal with some of that stuff earlier on. The sort of classic kind of sign of gentrification, and this is also the idea of sort of a rent gap, which is places where there's a lot of value in the land, but not say East Wash, classic example. Tremendous value on the land itself, but then a lot of the uses, the current uses, are things like auto shops or things like that. They just sort of, they look like, you're like, you look at them, you're like, wow, that's a really expensive piece of land, and they could build whatever the zoning says you can build up to, a lot of money, and it's a parking lot. So that tells you there's a gap. And when you start seeing those gaps, and most of those times we're just aware of them. You can see a space that sort of, looks like a lot of development happening around it, which then raises the value of the land. And so that's a really important part of gentrification, is this concept of proximity. What's happening around different spaces? And when there's sort of a symbiotic process where lots of sort of changes are happening at different sort of pieces of land, it affects all the neighboring pieces. And so that's a sort of pattern of gentrification, as well as the idea that sort of gentrification spreads. So as one neighborhood kind of goes through the process, the areas around it become very susceptible. So, and then the last part, which I think is really important for Madison, is which I think is the leading factor of gentrification here, is residential development. So this is, I think, what's pushing the demographic changes, as well as sort of what I'm talking about, which is changing the land value in the neighborhood unit. So what I've done some research that's coming out pretty soon, that it shows that as these new developments come up in Madison, residential developments that are 5 or more units, just sort of how they're separated there at the planning level, there is a measurable increase in evictions that occurs right before they lease up and right afterward. That's important sort of statistically. So I mean, we could see how these things have influenced the behavior of neighboring property owners and landlords and property management companies when a place like the Galaxy, the Constellation opens up. That yes, they might be providing new housing, but it's a signal to other people who own property that the neighborhood is worth more, the land value is worth more because of that development there. And so that is what pushes, I suspect, people to decide to start to evict more people. And this is another aspect, and this is important sort of for the policy discourse in Madison, I think, is that there's a lot of attention on what's called YIMBYism. Yes, in my backyard. It's the sort of the idea that we need to build our way out of this housing crisis and gentrification negative consequences by building as much housing as possible, because the idea is that that housing that gets built will then produce sort of a filtering process where people start moving into housing that's vacated by the folks that are moving in. That's not entirely correct, and that's not correct for a couple of reasons. One, we get a ton of people coming into Madison, so there's not like this shuffling that's happening where a new housing gets built and the finite population of Madison just shifts around in the existing housing as well as the new stuff. You have lots of people coming in that's adding stress onto the system. And so that sort of shuffling process is not able, or the filtering process is not able to keep up with population growth. Means that the problems continue. And in fact, they get exacerbated when you have very little affordable housing, increasing gap in what's available for people. And then you have these new units that come on that raise prices in the neighborhood as well as cause some eviction. So I think, we have to focus on that, and we have to have sort of a discourse that says, well, hey, we want housing, but we need, affordable housing. We need housing for everybody, good quality housing, and it shouldn't, kid ourselves that this is somehow going to just magically happen as we have new development.
So
Oh,
I'll,
I forgot the key point to that. Sorry, one thing. The study is that they show that this one study, because there's a lot of urban economists that are talking about this right now. What is the effect on the production of new housing developments on rents? And the idea is if you build new housing, supply and demand says rent should go down. But in fact, and there's been some really important pieces that actually try to show that. There's been some good criticism though that when you break up the rents of the neighboring units by segments, so the high end, the median, and the low rent units, it's the increases are not evenly distributed. So actually the higher rent units in a neighboring area go down, but the lower rents go up. So people who are, at the low end of the housing market are the ones who experience the rent increases. So it's experienced differently. That's the real critical part to the critiquing, I think, the idea that building housing is the way we're going to just get out of this situation.
Thank you. And Alder Kemble?
Yeah, that's a lot of info to absorb, Revel. So I hope this is recorded and put on someplace where people can go back and really think about everything that especially Revel Sims has saying, because it's dense information that comes from a lot of research and experience. So yeah, I agree that as Kaba said, that capitalism run amok, which is what we have in our city, produces these outcomes, but I don't think it's natural. It's not natural. Just because it's ubiquitous doesn't mean it's natural and the only way it can be. We can have make other choices. Other people, policymakers in other countries make other choices and have radically different societies and housing security because of those choices. And I just off the top of my head, I'm thinking about Uruguay, where 25% of people live in cooperative housing in that whole country. And that's a country that says housing is a human right. And then they make policy decisions to make sure that becomes reality. So, and Revel, when you're talking about displacement precedes gentrification, I'm just thinking about the neighborhood I live in on the north side here. There was mass displacement in the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, mass displacement, foreclosure crisis, and displacement of a kind that turned homeowners into renters overnight, and that brought in a new kind of property owner, which was hedge funds. Hedge funds, the kind of Jared Kushner firms that came in and, bought up modest houses, bought up, got into the sort of low income subsidized housing game, but they're in it to make a profit. So, so in our neighborhood, like this used to be pretty much all single family homes that were owned by people. And now that a lot of them are rented and there's a lot of turnover. And so that stability, this is kind of an invisible sort of displacement that you might not call gentrification, but it's this displacement that will precede that, in neighborhoods like this. So the cities are extremely powerful. We have a lot of power. We have the power of zoning. We have the power of planning. We have the power of selling bonds. We have the power of owning things. We have the power of regulation. And if we have a vision that says if we're committed to housing as a human right, there's a lot we can do together to ensure that people are housed, a lot. But the problem is we don't have that collective will in our city government right now. And Paul Soglin and I have just gone around and around and around when he was mayor about, when he was, asking for incentives for downtown developers. I'm like, Paul, the city, the downtown is the incentive itself. Like we don't need to, the value of being in Madison and being in downtown or the Isthmus, we are in a power position here as a city. We do not need to give incentives to anyone to do anything here because it is so valuable and people want to be here just because of our geography, our culture, and the way things are. And he was adamant that no, we have to give incentives for development, and especially the kind of development that was happening. Like, no, we don't. And in the last year or two, we've gotten presentations at the council from our Department of Planning, Community and Economic Development, from our, the director who comes from the housing sector, who's saying, look, the kind of incentives, the tax credit affordable housing developers, they need more incentives from us to make things truly affordable. And, I don't know, like they keep coming to us asking, well, how high will you go? How high will you go to subsidize for-profit developers to create housing that isn't actually really affordable, but it is by HUD standards, by some standards. So even our own staff who's working on this are realizing the limits of the tools that have been traditionally used for public investment in housing. And so, but we have so much more that we haven't used yet. And I'm going to segue into Olivia here because I really want to hear her voice. But one of that is, we have done land banking before. The city has owned property, has purchased property. But what we've done in the past is just given it for free or at a high discount price to for-profit developers who turn around and make money off it. When we could have retained that value in the public sphere, retain that value for the city and for a public, basically in the commons, and had either a nonprofit or a cooperative or a land trust do provide the housing on that, which, what that does is take the land off the speculative market. So that price is out. So even if rental property is built on that, the price of the land is out of that equation. And that's something that several of us are working on, a land banking policy just for affordable housing that would do that. That would say, look, if the city's gonna invest public money in land, we're no longer gonna just turn it over to for-profit housing developers. We're gonna retain it or sell it to a land trust or to a cooperative have some form of ownership of land tenure whereby that can't go back onto the speculative market. And partnering with a community land trust is a really powerful way to do that. And so I'd like to have Olivia talk about how that might work.
Thanks, Rebecca. So I love this whole discussion, and everything everyone's saying is like so on point. And I would add that when you look at real estate, typically most of the value of real estate is in land, and the value of land is created socially. So if you think about like what's a cool neighborhood, what makes it cool? It's people, it's culture, it's things going on. And once the price goes up enough that the neighborhood changes and those cool people move somewhere else, like you're not retaining the value there. You're allowing individuals to profit from that socially created value. So the idea of a community land trust is to hold land off of the market to keep it permanently affordable and development community controlled for the benefit of low-income people especially. And community land trust, we do this using a ground lease. So we own the land and we have a ground lease with any institution or individual who operates something on the land. And so it's a 99-year ground lease usually, and it's in there is an agreement that if they sell, we have right of first refusal, but they can also sell the improvements to someone else at an affordable price that's predetermined by an equation. Oftentimes it's based on cost of living, or it's a percentage of the like increase in appraised value of that property over time. So basically, compared to land around it or properties around it, community land trust developments stay affordable, get more affordable over time. So if you look at really large community land trusts, like Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in Boston, they started with houses very close to the core of Boston that cost like $90,000. And, you know, now those homes are selling for like $130,000, while prices of homes across the street right near downtown are $500,000. So that if we think about what might happen in Madison, right now, the average home price in Madison is still below the median of the United States median home price that's selling. And where it feels really expensive, you know, frankly. And so it's kind of alarming how quickly overall the prices are going up. And I think, you know, we'll see something that another scholar from UCLA, Ananya Roy, calls racial banishment, which is kind of an idea that came from an activist in LA that like people in some of these really expensive cities, people of color just can't live there anymore, or really low income or lower class folks. And oftentimes people of color just get totally pushed out of an urban area completely. And if we're not taking advantage of relatively low for now prices to take them off the market, we're going to see just exploding values and increased financialization of land.
Excellent, thank you. And actually, I do want to stay with Olivia for a little bit. And you all anticipated our timing for moving into solutions perfectly. So thank you for that. But I'm wondering, Olivia, if you can talk to your efforts or your goals in Madison. And then I'm also just wondering more broadly, is there a certain tipping point at which, like, if you can take a certain amount of land in an area off the speculative market, then you really start to move things in a much more people and community centered way versus speculative profit by developers?
Gosh, I wish there were research on that. That just hasn't been done. Like, I mean, you could look at specific neighborhoods and see how prices have stabilized, but across the city level, I don't think we really know a tipping point. But, you know, as much land as you can take off the market, that'll stay affordable. And I don't, there was my research team from my dissertation did a little study on like, having more community land trust owned land meant that it did stabilize home values around it. Like they might have gone up slightly, but it did not decrease the value. It did, like, the values did not accelerate necessarily as much as they would have. So there's like a tiny bit of research on that I could share, but I don't think we know, you know, tipping point or kind of where the line is. But when you have enough in a neighborhood, it can make an impact. And what was the other part of your question?
Oh, I was just wondering if you could talk in Madison in particular, you know, what you're doing and what your sort of goals are moving forward.
Yeah, so I'll share that we kind of restarted as an organization in a way about a year ago. So we became independent again from Commonwealth Development, who are they're our good buddies, and we coordinate with them a lot, but we're kind of revamping a lot of our systems now. And so we're still kind of, you know, figuring out what's possible, who we can partner with, how we can grow. But I can, you know, we have 69 homes, single family homes right now, and 26 acres of non-housing land. That's all community gardens and prairie and farmland. And, you know, we are hopefully getting this, I think it's confirmed that we're getting the CDBG and city funds for doing 4 new homes on the north side in the next couple years. So we're starting to do new development again. I would really love to see more commercial, you know, I would love to do some kind of commercial or partner with groups doing rental housing. And really we need, dedicated funding streams in order to do that, and dedicated like land transfers. And, it's a small shop. We don't have extra money to buy things. So we need that dedication in order to make that kind of growth.
And I just wanted to add a few things here. I really like the term that Olivia used called racial banishment. I think that really, really hits the point. There are lots of things that have been said here that are very, very important. Rebecca mentioned how gentrification is not natural, and she is very right on that. It's not natural, it's actually artificial, but it's financially driven. One of the key components here that is really often overlooked is the policy part that it plays. Um, for example, Rebecca kind of talked on some of the topics about for-profit developers. Actually, when you look at some of the key for-profit developers that are focused on housing in Madison, that are very, very policy supported and get a lot of city and state tax money, really are doing very little into mitigating this problem on a long-term scale. And what they really do is they try to solve the problem in a short-term scale, but the long-term scale, it actually enhances gentrification. So what I mean by that is get a whole bunch of money from the city, build some houses and call it affordable, have these people rent it 2 or 5 years down the line. They cannot even rent to be there once those policies expire. So some of the tools that are being currently used are not well engineered to solve the problem on a long-term scale. They are engineered to solve it on a short-term scale. So policy would be passed and, oh, we've just built 200 new affordable housing and we put 10 million and we've attracted 100 million private fund. In reality, what is happening is now you create these houses, you put poor, minority, low income people into these houses, they grow into these houses. 10 years down the line, those people who live in those houses have not built one amount of equity. One amount of equity. That nonprofit has become 10 times richer. The person whose was the houses were initially designed to be built for have no ownership in it. What that is really doing is increasing the wealth gap, is increasing the racial banishment that was just mentioned. They have zero ownership in it. But the policy, when it's designed, it's intentional to create affordable housing. On the short run, it seems to accomplish that. But on the long run, it's actually enhancing that gentrification that we're talking about. Now, the developers are long-term folks. I am a developer myself, and I've been involved in this business for 10 years. As a developer, you're looking at the long-term goal. What is your return on investment on a long-term goal? The policies tend to be engineered towards solving short-term problems, but ultimately, including some of the non-profit organizations that are very focused on housing, are really not handling that. And a good part of that can be traced back to the tools, including that HUD program and the WIDA programs. The way they're structured has nothing built in to help the actually low people to have ownership of those particular things. And that itself leads into more gentrification because the wealth and ownership becomes more concentrated.
I think that's like a really good segue into a question we had from Eleanor in the chat. So like on the flip side, as you kind of alluded to, the fact that home ownership is one of the surest ways to build wealth. So Kaba and Olivia, maybe if you could answer the question about, is it possible to then pursue private ownership without becoming a gentrifier, kind of on the other side of things?
Yeah, so I'll say a few things first before I get to that, which is Kaba is right that any state and federal kind of subsidized rental housing, you have to stay low income to have your lease renewed every year. That's real messed up. That means it's really hard to even make higher income in order to save it, even if you're saving it somewhere else, not owning a house. So anyway, to segue into home ownership, I would push back slightly because after the 2008 crisis, we saw the racial wealth gap widen because the people of color, especially Black people, were more impacted by foreclosures and the foreclosure crisis, and they lost a lot of their wealth, even more so than before. And so one thing that's great about community land trust homeownership is it kind of balances stability with wealth building. So people do own, in the homeownership model in a community land trust, people do own a house on top of the land and they have a mortgage. It just costs less. And so, and then they get to sell it at a rate that increases at a sustainable level, basically. So they don't get the full appreciation, but there's been studies on how much people are able to save in community land trust homes. And on average, in the last 30 years and nationally, people who put in an average down payment of $1,800 are able to come away with $14,000 in savings and in wealth. And additionally, community land trusts homeowners went through foreclosure at 1/10 of the rate of regular homeowners during that crisis. And so there's, and their value kind of increases at a predictable rate rather than like plummeting and going, you know, up and down. So it's kind of a stable investment, and it balances that stability, which housing, without housing stability, you can't like do so many things. You know, if you're bouncing from apartment to apartment, or at risk of eviction, that becomes your main focus in life rather than like getting that job you really wanted, or putting your money in a Roth IRA if you have any extra, or, you know, all the other things, putting your kids through school in a stable environment. So I think, you know, kind of balancing out these interests is really important.
And I'll just add a little bit onto that, Matthew. I think Olivia answered that very well. Home ownership is definitely part of it, but the key is balance.
Was that you cooking ramen?
The key ultimately is balance. When low-income folks own a lot of properties and the economy kind of takes its natural course and they become out of jobs soon, all of a sudden they can't even own. And what is often missing in all these pictures is equity building. So for the current model and the tools that we have, for example, has almost no equity. You treat the low income folks as renters. The equity is built by the developers. The actual people who actually need the city's help are only consumers. They are just a tenant. And that model definitely does not solve gentrification. That much we know. Now, in terms of home ownership, the model that, for example, Olivia and her team talks of, even if the home ownership part, they don't own the land, they're at least building equity. You see, so once they exit, they at least have something that they can buy somewhere else, or at least have built some kind of wealth. That is the key component that we tend to oversee. Now, if you just buy a whole bunch of properties and give it to low-income people over 10, 30 years, if those people don't maintain their job, they will probably even lose that home ownership. But if you help them build equity down the line, then their ownership becomes more secure. And that's the component that's missing in the current tools that we have and in most of the nonprofits that we deal with, which gradually tends to shift things into gentrification, even though that is not the intention.
Yeah, thank you. And Tyson, do you want to ask your question? Great questions, by the way. Keep them coming. Yep.
Oh, sorry. I hope this makes sense. So the previous speaker, I forgot your name. I'm so sorry. Where are you? I'm trying to look for you in Zoom. Years ago. Could you elaborate on the home ownership aspect in community land trust that you're talking about and how it does factor in? I think you said it factors in, or something factors in with community land trust and the like home appreciation and resale value, and that being, is that I'm not quite sure I'm understanding that. Could you like elaborate on that maybe a little bit or clarify, or maybe I'm not understanding what you're saying? Sorry.
Yeah, thank you for that. So basically, when we bring a house into the land trust, or we develop a house, the person is only buying the house and we own the land. And then we have a ground lease with them. And part of the agreement in the ground lease is that when they sell the house, the maximum they can get from it is what they paid for it plus 25% of the increase in the appraised value. So we take appraisals at the beginning and the end, and the difference, you know, is normally you get the whole amount of the final appraised value, but they get what they paid plus 25% of the increase. And then we also have an incentive program to do capital improvements. So they get 100% of the value of capital improvements, like a roof or, you know, a new room added on or something. So the seller gets to keep what they invested plus some of the appreciated value, and the home also gets more affordable over time compared to homes around it.
And is that model possible in Wisconsin based on state statute and law currently? And is that done like basically through like a zoning and planning ordinances, or how is that like a complex?
We're doing it, right? We've been doing it since 1991, and there are a few other community land trusts in Wisconsin. And we have 59 permanently affordable homes following that formula. And we're a nonprofit, and we do the development, and we use a ground lease.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I want to stick with the solutions, and then maybe Revel, ask you to talk about what innovative approaches do you see elsewhere in the US or internationally that Madison could learn from and perhaps implement?
Yeah, this is kind of where I get in trouble. You know, there's a couple things. One, there is a shift towards decommodifying housing, and that means a lot of different things. But that is partly about removing issues like speculation, appreciation, and land value that contributes to the increasing costs, and critically questioning sort of that appreciation. So understanding, as Olivia had mentioned earlier, you know, that land value is really created socially, and so through proximity of lots of interactions of developers and people and city and generations historically going back. So you know, it's not, and this is why, I mean, the thing that got me into trouble last time I was talking about this, you know, a certain portion of rent is always theft. I mean, and I know that's sort of a provocative term, maybe not so much in this group of folks, but you know, it's the idea that this is value that's created socially, and that difference between what the land value is, right? You know, and what the structure is. That's a really important separation, because what causes the depreciation of land value? It is very much along the lines of what Olivia was saying. And it's also this sort of real interesting symbiotic process that happens between lots of different people and developers and city policies and transportation and sewer lines and electrical, you know, services. And this is what provides land value that is then introduced into rents. And so you have structures, for example, that are like, I know rent control is sort of off of the out of the realm of possibility for us here in Wisconsin, but you know, things like the idea that you have a building, say, that is being paid off, the mortgage is over, right? You know, the owners had it for a long time, you know, and they're sitting on this thing and they're still increasing rents. So, you know, what explains that? You know, it's clearly supply and demand. So they're able to just sort of, you know, increase the rents because more people are coming in and stuff like that. But it also has to do with land value, essentially, which is about all this value that we create as people. So one of the things I think we have to sort of change the discourse and how we're talking about, you know, what is land value? What is the value that we're all sort of talking about? Well, we pay the rent. What is that rent? Like, how do we understand what that actually means? It's not just value that the owner of that property has created through an amazing built structure that may have pools and, you know, a market on the bottom and all those wonderful things that we all sort of like, those amenities. But it's something much bigger that's socially produced. So I think we really have to sort of change the way we talk about value. And the sort of flip side of this is, you know, I'm a big fan of community land trusts, but I worry about scalability. And so and the models I tend to look at, you know, come out of sort of a, you know, after, you know, really World War II, you know, and I don't want to sort of get into this sort of Europe example type stuff, but, you know, the European countries went in a different direction in terms of how they were going to deal with that housing crisis of the Depression. And we went a different way. And I think we need to sort of return to some of these concepts about the social value of housing as a fundamental human right, and the idea that this a gap in affordability is never going away. I mean, economists talk about it as market failure, and it just means that there's no money in doing low income housing, and there'll never be money in low income housing. So there is a fundamental role for the state, meaning us, the people, to be able to say we have to intervene in this housing market, as Kava was talking about. Capitalism works according to its own logic, and will continue to do so. So we have to intervene and re-embed that market within our social considerations and concerns, and that may mean, providing things like, this is where I also get into trouble, municipally financed public housing. And we need to call it something else, social housing. But it's the idea that we will never build our way out of this, even if we're getting all the WIDA subsidies to do low income housing tax credits. We're never going to have enough. I mean, what is the recent analysis? 30,000 units that is the gap that Madison has, or something, or Dane County. I can't remember, but my colleague Kurt Polson would, and maybe Heidi can let us know what that gap number is off the top of your heads. But it's just not going away. And the crisis, I think, that we're heading in, especially post-COVID, but post-financial 2008 crisis, it is increasing precarity, lots of increasing disparities in urban situations in particular, where poor people, rich people, those sort of polarization of our cities is happening all over the place, and that's connected to this process of gentrification. So I really do have a big proponent. We're not going to not have federal programs that are going to come in like they did previously, and we shouldn't wait for them. But maybe a multi-city, sort of fund, a sort of regional perspective that is able to sort of build up a large enough trust to start doing stuff. And I'm really happy to see this. There's been a couple papers that have been put out by community groups recently. There's one in New York that's been circulating. There's one in California that just came out last week, making this, in fact, argument that cities need to engage in providing public housing again, and do it in a way maybe along the lines of what we're learning from the Land Trust about this experience, as well as all the work that communities have been doing since the 1950s, obviously, that teaches us, hey, we can build housing, better. We can organize it in ways that are just and create communities. We know how to do that stuff. So it's really about, I think, providing the argument. And I think one of those arguments actually has to be, in addition to these sort of provocative terms of decommodifying housing and stuff like that, or rent is theft and all that stuff that's just going to ruffle feathers. I think there's a strong argument to make that this is a community development or an economic development model, because why is it that how many people are paying more than half of their income, household income, towards rent? If you can free up even a small percentage of that, say lower that back down to 30, which is the sort of rule of thumb, right, for affordability, that margin now can then be redistributed to other economic activities, whether that be recreation or things that people are denied now because they just don't have money for, that are not recreation. And so I just don't get it. And I think that I could see a place like Madison could have a real big impact as a model for other places to follow, because there are unique situations here that don't exist in other places. In LA, I mean, let's try to get, Olivia, you work in the Land Trust, so you'll know the FICCIC, the Figueroa Corridor Coalition. This was a struggle over the Staples Center. Y'all, I don't know if you watch basketball, hockey, whatever, but Lakers, Kings, they play in that big monstrosity right there in the middle of downtown LA. And we were all organizing against that to get what at that time was community benefits agreement. So we basically fought them at the development process and said, hey, we're gonna make this really expensive for you by dragging it out and contesting every little small thing. And in that process, we won some things. So we won money to be distributed for affordable housing. And by the time we got that money, the land value had increased so much in LA that you couldn't buy any land, and that's where we're at right now in Madison, is that it's a unique possibility where we're sort of at the beginning levels of some very serious, difficult times in terms of people who are coming in and what's available for us and the type of housing development that's happening right now. That if we don't sort of move in on some of these things, that door is going to close. And so I think the argument for something bigger than, hey, we just need to get some more LIHTC housing, that's low income tax credit housing, because stuff I've shown in Orange County, we did this analysis, and even the stuff that's coming in, for tax credits, that's affordable housing. It's not affordable for the people who need it in those neighborhoods. And so it even is actually contributing to part of this demographic transition. So, it's not going to be LIHTC. It's not, I'm sorry, we need to scale up community land trust, but I think the only way to really scale things up, and this is sort of part of the legacy of planning and sort of planning reformists, is to think about, how do we mobilize state resources? And I think that's the way really things need to go, because that's the only way out of this situation, as far as I could see. I mean, maybe, some of my other colleagues would tell me I'm totally wrong on this, and I'm sure they would, but that's the way I see it.
Can I just nudge you on the specifics of that a little bit? Because, there's federally, or, there's the Faircloth Amendment that we can't build over the 1990s level of public housing. And then there's not a lot of federal subsidy for public housing. Are you saying publicly financed social housing? Does that mean nonprofit owned and operated? And how would it stay permanently affordable? Because maybe the land could be put in a land trust.
Yes, I think it should be probably put in the land trust. I think that model is the thing that needs to be replicated and scaled up with state support. I think that's what people are arguing, is that it's the acquisition of the land costs, and there's there is funding for development. Like the development piece is something that I think people can figure out, like the actual building of it. But I think most people are worried about it is how do you maintain it, and that was the big problem with public housing. I mean, it was systematically underfunded. So it led to the deterioration that everybody associates with public housing previously. So how do you do that? I don't think it can magically be funded by just rent streams. That's just not enough. So it's part of, this is where the social obligation comes in, right? It's like it's going to have to be subsidized, and that means maybe we should be taxing property sales over a certain amount. That money goes straight into a fund. I know that nobody likes to talk about that because Madison's heavily taxed already and all that stuff, but even my middle of the road colleagues at UCLA, I mean, they're just like, the only way that they see out of this is tax any property sale over $1 million, which in LA is not that uncommon now. It sounds crazy, but I think it's the taxes. I don't know about this, the policy you're talking about, though. Is that a state policy about not building more public housing than already exists? And I'm wondering what the language is on that specifically, and if it's how public housing is defined, because I'm sure, I imagine there can be some creative solutions around that.
It's the Clinton era law that said that municipalities, public entities can't, basically it froze the level of publicly owned and developed housing at the levels it was there to open up the market for private developers.
Is this part of the the Hope 6 reforms
law.
and stuff?
It's a federal law. So I mean, so I want to jump in here. We need to lobby and change on every level, on the federal level. Not only that, but getting back to this taxing issue. The percentage of our, municipal and county budgets that are funded by the property tax level has increased and increased and increased since the 70s. We don't get as much state aid. We don't get as much federal aid. I mean, that we've never received the aid, and school districts, the same thing. So, since the Reagan era, we've just been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. So it looks like, the municipal governments and county governments and school districts are the bad guys taxing the crap out of everyone, when in reality, it's been the federal and state governments that have put the squeeze on us and reduce the aids. So we need to, when you talk, Revel, about, social housing and social responsibility, we need to think of this at all levels and really lobby. When I came into office, I thought I want to be the anti-privatizer. I want to be the commonizer. I want to recommonize, what has been privatized. And, we can't do that alone at the municipal level. We can try in little bits and pieces, but we really need a whole national movement behind this, for not only for social housing, but healthcare, and all of the things that we need, that are rights of people that we need to survive. Um, so but one of the things that I know Elder Evers was on here. I think he dropped off, but we did a budget amendment last year to hire more staff in our community development authority agency. So we wouldn't have to be paying our affordable housing funds out to developers, but we could have that expertise in-house and not have to pay their developers exorbitant fees, because developers are in the business they are in because they make money doing it, and 10 to 18% fees are not uncommon. And that's just that's like you said, theft. That's just wasted value, that if we did that in-house, or if we worked with a nonprofit developer, they wouldn't be as exorbitant. So we are looking at increasing the capacity of our own public resources, staffing resources, and as I mentioned before, actual ownership of land, our land banking resources to do that. Andy put in the comment, if we had a municipal bank, we could fund some of this stuff. And I've been working with Andy and others to try to see, what it would take for us to charter a municipal bank. The city already does a lot of banking functions. It does investments, it does mortgages, we already do a lot of banking functions, and it wouldn't be a huge step to actually create a municipal bank and stop paying US Bank, like, I don't know how many millions of dollars we pay them to do our banking every year, but it's a lot. And we could provide those services to other local units of government for modest fees. And with that money, we can reinvest. Not only can we do our own banking, but we could actually, charge modest fees to other units of government, which are less than the commercial banks, and then invest that money in these other priorities. Because the getting back to the property tax issue, Revel, and you're saying, why do rents keep going up and why does the value keep going up? Well, it's this, a big part of it is the property taxes going up. And why do the property taxes go up? Because it's this cycle that, someone alluded to at the beginning of this talk of like, okay, we want to make sure there's affordable housing, but it's also in the municipality's best interest to increase land values, because that's how we get our revenue. And we depend so much on that revenue because the federal and state governments has put the squeeze on us. And it's a vicious cycle. And I've had these conversations with our planning and real estate staff of, it's okay for us to invest in land and have that land value stay the same or go down. It's okay, but these are our collective resources, the sewer, the water, the streets, the trees, the lights, all of this is our collective resource that we fund with our collective money. And we ought to be able to retain that value in society and not allow people to profit so much off of it. So I think exploring the expansion of social housing in whatever way we need to do it until the Faircloth Amendment is overturned is something that we really need to think about doing at scale.
And I just wanted to add a few things here. This is a very exciting meeting to be part of. And I think both Revel and Rebecca are right on point. The fact is that we know what we're doing right now is not working. That is very clear, that the tools that we have right now is not working. But the system is designed in such a way, just like Rebecca said, it's like this vicious loop. The city needs money to operate, and that amount keeps increasing each time. The developers know that, and the only way the city can get that is when the developers develop so they can get more tax money. And then the developers would hold the city to give them funding to do that. But the bottom line is there are no simple answers. But whatever the answer has to be, it has to be communal. People have to be involved, like citizens like us, having these discussions to really look at the problem. There are people behind there who don't want to see these things change because it's a big business. Real estate is probably the biggest business you can think about going on in town. And those who are in charge benefiting out of that don't want to see those changes. But the key is community involvement. Now, taking this void farm, for example, that we're working on, and I don't know how many of you know about this, 65 acres of land in the heart of Madison just came for sale at a price of $11 million. Just before it hit the market, a bunch of us got together and we were like, dude, we need to do something about this, because if we don't, it's gonna fall in the hands of developers. And we are having a huge challenge going against that wave, because it's 65 acres again. And that's really how I think I got into this particular discussion. But the amount of challenge and barrier that we have to overcome to preserve this land is enormous. First, we have to raise $11 million. And when we buy this property, our goal is to do exactly the opposite of what gentrification does. Part of the land we want to just preserve for agriculture in the heart of the city. Part of it, we just want to leave it natural, and only 12 acres of the 65 acres we are planning to develop. Now you turn that around, no developer is gonna do that. You don't buy $11 million worth of land in the heart of a city and have the opportunity to make millions more and reserve it and just not develop it. But this is what it will take for us to be able to stop this vicious cycle. And it's not going to be easy, but whatever the answers are, it has to involve communal effort. The politicians alone cannot do it, and the developers certainly would not do it. And so I think that's always important to know. The key thing is to know that we need to have a balanced system intentionally designed to address these gaps that we talk about and improve quality of life. But if you just leave it to take its natural course, the policies need to have money and the developers need to be developing to make more money. So that natural cycle leads to more and more of this gentrification that we're talking about.
I see Tyson, you've had your hand raised, so go ahead.
Oh, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, first, just thank everyone for this panel. I really appreciate this discussion. It's obviously a complicated, nuanced issue that has a lot of facets and dynamics to it. So I've got a bunch of questions, but I'll try to keep it quick and only ask two. The first one is pretty point blank, like in regards to, well, I guess just like limiting the, I guess, property increases or property assessments that was referred to with the community land banking, like, and how that would affect potentially schools and like their revenue for the school districts. Because it just seems to me like there's so many multifaceted and connected, like, you know, systems that we all need kind of need to address to actually really resolve or like accomplish these things that we're talking about. And I get frustrated by this, honestly, because it's something that we really do need to address. And it's just really hard. It's confusing. And it's, you know, it seems like, to me at least, there's things that in the immediate term, you know, doing in theory are good, but then perpetuate the problems in our market and in our housing now. But like, for example, market rate housing in general, like from my understanding right now, based on what we are doing or what's feasible, like at this moment, we need more housing in general. The city's growing, we don't have enough housing, just straight up market value housing. And what I kind of see is almost like a failure to address this issue effectively because it's really complex. And it seems like it almost is making it more difficult. And please tell me, someone correct me, because I don't know. I'm literally just seeing what I see. Like, it seems like it is when folks want to make it difficult for developers to, like, you know, develop these, you know, housing units or, you know, have arguments of historical preservation that the community wants or whatever. I think it is good and developers should be held accountable, and we really need to address the entire market and system in general. But what I've seen is like, it seems like that is stopping just more market rate housing in general, or we're not even able to like feasibly accomplish building more affordable housing units that we talk about. Like, I just don't see a path. I see a bunch of like kind of patchwork things that we're doing. And in theory, they all sound really good, but it always seems like there's some hurdle or boundary or, you know, something that makes that theory not actually come into practice. And when I say come into practice, I mean come into practice where it's really equitable, or it's really affordable, and it's really for everyone. And I do believe in, community control and the best, the commons and taking that, what Rebecca was saying. However, I don't at the same time in my head. I grew up low income and, in government housing or, affordable housing, low income housing. And also, the services that cities and governments have provided, I've seen them be good and in representing certain segments of the community, but not mine, or not the most marginalized, and perpetuating the same systems or same disparities and same issues, just in a different structure. And that's just another concern of mine too. Like, how are we going to do and address this really complicated issue that seems to hit on almost damn near everything that we need to address, and do so in a way that's not just a good plan, but that we can actually feasibly do. And in the interim, while we're getting there, like Rebecca said, we need to change federal law, state law, local law, as a municipality, as a county, or as a state, of what we can accomplish right now. Like, what are things that we really can do while still continuing on towards that larger goal at hand that we're not there yet, because we don't have, there's so many structures and federal, state, local that need to be these changes, and we're just not there yet. So like, I don't know. I guess what I would really like to hear is, I hear a lot of really great ideas, and like how my brain works is I would really like to hear what failures have happened, or how we have tried to address things that have seemed like they are good ideas that would increase affordability of housing, or address, housing in general in a community, and it not have worked. Like, what have we done that has not worked? And what are we doing now that is actually working that we can feasibly do based on what we have the power to accomplish, at the city level, county level, etc. Sorry, and I was jogging there quick, so I hope that made sense. It's kind of rambling.
That encapsulated a lot of the frustration that I think a lot of us hold, and so yeah, I get it. I can say I just
really appreciate all of you on this call. This is a really, really great discussion. So thank you.
I'll let other people jump in on this, but I just want to say I was talking to the city of Middleton, city staff recently, because they actually put community land trust in their new comprehensive plan, because they said they've tried everything in the last couple decades, especially around affordable home ownership, and nothing has stayed affordable, and so they were saying the thing they thought would work was small lot sizes, and they did this kind of new urbanist development, so it was small and walkable and quaint, and of course now those are extremely expensive because that's a desirable place to live. So I hear what your frustrations, and I don't know, I think the things that we were getting to when Revel was talking about public financing at a low percentage, public banking that goes into affordable rental that reaches the lowest income. And then if we can keep it permanently affordable and also make sure there's money to do maintenance, that's hard to do that at scale with all the city's constraints, because we also have to organize at the state and federal levels to make sure the money flows to the cities to do more, to do it at the scale it needs to happen. But that's my answer.
I can jump in a little quick here. That is a very loaded question, Tyson. Olivia just said, it kind of encompasses almost all of what we talked about here. And as Revel said, what is clear to us, your first question is, what have we been doing that has not worked? The answer to that is whatever we're doing right now, we know is not working. And what we are doing right now is we have this system of state and federal funding called HUD and WIDA that works to develop affordable housing through private and nonprofit sectors in the name of creating it. And we've been doing this for the past 2 decades, and it's getting more and more and more vicious. It's a cycle that asks for more money from taxpayers to develop affordable housing that does not become affordable in the long run. So the answer to that question is whatever we're doing right now is not working. It's leading to more and more tax money being needed and less affordable housing in the long run and more gentrification. The second part of your question, what we can do now or what we can do. Um, the first way to solve a problem is to identify that what you're doing is not right or is not solving it. It's up to us now to start to think about new ways. That's the beauty of being human. We are creative folks that can always invent and create new things. So now that we know what we're doing is not working, it's time for us to start to brainstorm on what can we possibly do. One of those options is what Olivia and her team is doing, which is land banking. And somebody mentioned the scalability of those things. But those are not the only ways. Another thing we can do is to come together as a community, like I just mentioned with Void Farm. Here is a piece of land for sale for $11 million. You are guaranteed that if the community does not do anything to buy it, a developer would buy it and build high rises and make a profit and gentrify it. The community coming together, we have over the past 3 months, we have gotten people to commit to invest almost $2 million of private funding. We have talked with the county and they're committing to about a significant amount of money. These are communal efforts where we're going to the neighborhoods and tell them, don't let this happen. Let's work together and put in $1 if you can. If you cannot put in $1, just support us if you can. That is what it will take. That's another model that we are looking at. The bottom line is whatever we're doing right now does not work. We know we need to find a new way to do things. And that is where we're at. Having these discussions is very vital to that, but our imaginations and capacities are limitless. And you are guaranteed to find an answer if you work hard at it. So it's a time that's very exciting, very interesting to be part of this process. And now that we know what we're doing is not working, the time is to start to think. And there's no magic bullets to the problem or simple answers of, oh, this is not working now, we just have to do this and all our problems will disappear. It's much more complicated that you're dealing with a capitalist system that is capital driven and dealing with one of the most capital hefty problems. So there's no simple answers. There are lobbyists that are working at the federal and state, like Rebecca said. There are intentional people who are paid millions and millions of dollars to inject these hurdles in the system to make it more difficult to solve because it's profitable. That's what you're going after. So it's not a simple problem. Again, you're dealing with a very hefty capital problem in a fundamental capital system. But one thing we know that has to be done is we have to come as a community and start brainstorming, and each and every one of us has the responsibility and the ability to make that difference. And we at Void Farm are just a small sample trying to set up a prototype. And again, Olivia and her team is another prototype. There might be the city buying more land like somebody mentioned, or there might be new ways that we haven't even thought about. But what we know is what we're doing right now is not working and we need to find a way to make it work.
And I think kind of as a follow-up to that, Tyson had a question in the chat. I don't know, Tyson, if you want to ask it yourself or.
Which question?
Kind of just about like the tie-in with the nonprofit industrial complex.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, like
it's 8
o'clock. A lot of you, I'm sure, compared to a lot of spaces, probably understand or like, know just nonprofits aren't always good. But there's an entity, an organization, and a power structure. Just because someone's a nonprofit doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to be representative or effective in addressing these issues or community. And so, I hear a lot of times, these plans or, ideas, but that refer to, oh yes, let's bring it to nonprofit control and, structure it within a nonprofit like framework, which kind of concerns me still. Like, I get it and it makes total sense, but I'm interested to hear how to avoid that, nonprofit industrial complex that we see perpetuated, especially in Madison, which has, I think, some of the like most per capita nonprofits in the country, I believe. Yet again, we still have some of the worst disparities and issues in the country. So Yeah, like, I guess there's that question, and then I'll wait because I have another one.
Tyson, I just want to add one thing. I think I mentioned that earlier about nonprofits, and you are right on point. I am here representing a nonprofit, but you are very right that nonprofits are not always good. And Madison is probably one of the most examples of that. We are probably the most nonprofit per capita in the whole state, or in the whole state that I know of. If not the number one, we are one of the top 10, that's for sure. Nonprofits is just a vehicle. Sometimes what leads people to organize as a nonprofit is actually because of the tools that are set up to navigate the process to solve them. But you are very right on track. Nonprofit is not always good. And there's a lot of that in Madison. And sometimes they contribute to the problem that is leading to this. Like I just mentioned, they go after tax, state and federal tax money to build houses in the name of affordable housing, and have zero plan of any ownership for these poor people who need housing. And when those conditions that they did to build get to that money is met, those people get right out the door. And like Travis just mentioned, when the property is paid off, the rents don't come down either. So there's a lot of components to nonprofits that are looking at the short-term solution. Politicians want to see more housing built. Nonprofits are like, yes, we can do it. But the solution to actually address the key problem that we're talking about here often tend to be missed. And there's a lot of nonprofits that fall into that. And I'm not here to say all of them are bad. There are lots of nonprofits that are really doing great work in our community. Let's not forget that. But there's also a lot of them that are basically money funnels. And that is very true.
Yeah, and I mean, not only
The
that,
thing about the nonprofit industrial complex, Tyson, is it's not that some nonprofits are good or bad.
Yeah.
It's the structure in which their existence even happens. And that is a structure in which capital exploits land, labor, and humans so much, and our governments do not tax capital enough, so that the social needs of the people are not met by with our collective resources, because we don't have enough collective resources to meet the needs of the people, because we don't tax the profiteers. And because we don't tax because their corporations aren't paying their fair share of taxes, and because what they do is exploit people, there is all these human needs and human misery that goes unmet. So what do? The corporations form philanthropic arms, or there are family foundations, and they, take a little bit of that money that's been, ill-gotten gains off the exploitation of people, funnel it back into organizations that say they're doing, community work. And that somehow is supposed to make it all better. So it's not like this nonprofit or that nonprofit is good. It's the very structure in which nonprofits exist and philanthropy exists that is the problem. And if we're going to attack that problem, we have to tax the rich. We have to go back up to 80-90% taxing wealth, and actually take those resources back, so the corporations and the wealthy, the wealthy family dynasties can't keep amassing wealth, but that wealth has to come back into society to be spent in a democratic way on the needs of the people. That's the thing. Like, let's be clear about what the nonprofit industrial complex is.
Yeah.
And it's that. And if we're serious about dealing with that, we are gonna, something I've been trying to do is get in a small way, get a real study done of how our city assesses commercial property. A number of years ago, we had some assessors in our city assessors department who got fired and left because they kind of blew the whistle and said, look, we're leaving 9, 10, maybe up to $15 million a year in the hands of these downtown property owners because we're not assessing them enough. And that means that, people who own, houses, residential taxpayers, pay a lot more of the property tax burden than the downtown commercial property owners do. And in a very interesting twist of events, at 2 council meetings ago, when there was an issue about the Amazon property, about rezoning, rezoning the property on which Amazon has just built a distribution facility, they brought up a graph of how much, what percentage of the property tax in Madison was paid by commercial property tax owners and residential property taxpayers. And in the 70s, it was about 50-50. And in the graph they showed now, it's more like 3/4 residential property taxpayers and 1/4 commercial. And they used it to make a really stupid, convoluted argument. But that, that's where we see this, deregulation, this reduction of taxes, this austerity regimes of the last 30-40 years really hitting the people and setting us against each other. So at a larger level, we really need a movement to for fairness in taxation, and to make sure that it's not that people suffering the effects of capitalism, suffering the highest levels of exploitation, aren't just depending on the drips and drops from philanthropy to get their needs met.
So yeah, and Rebecca, that goes into
actually, sorry, Tyson, I want to make sure Timothy's had up his hand for a while. So I'm going to give him a chance.
Diane. I know some of you, not most of you. I'm a retired attorney, 40 years of practice in the development and financing of low-income housing, and largely representing nonprofits in that effort. Land Trust for a while was my client, for example, when we did the Troy Gardens project. And I was on the legislative committee that redrafted the residential property tax statutes about 15, 18 years ago. And I was very pleased, and it was a lot of effort to bring that formula for property taxation in line with HUD's formulas and tax credit formulas in terms of low income, 30%, 50%, 80% low income. So I think overall it's important to step back and say, what kinds of people are we trying to assist? If we're looking at the very lowest of income people, low-income housing tax credit deals don't help them, right? You really got to be middle income to fit into that boot. And so looking at the lower income people, and for a lot of those people, what they're interested in, and even gentrification, this is an issue, what they're interested in is stable housing where they can plan for the future and they know they're going to be able to stay in their home and they have an idea of what it's going to cost in terms of rent increases going forward. So I've seen and drafted some leases. The traditional residential lease, as you know, is a year-to-year lease, right? And it's up to the landlord to set the rent for the next year for, continuing the lease. Well, in other communities and in some in Madison, what we've done is long-term leases where the tenant is by contract in the lease allowed to stay in that apartment unless they screw up, right? And the formula for raising rent is included in the lease. So if the property insurance premiums go up, the rents have to go up, right? If maintenance expenses, you got to have a replacement reserve. Otherwise, the people who are in there today, when replacements are not being made, aren't paying, and the people in the future pay when the roof is needed and you have to go out and get a mortgage to pay for it, okay? So I think looking at what population you're trying to serve is important, and recognizing, at least in my experience, following World War II in the late 40s, the 50s, into the 60s, people didn't buy housing with the expectation of selling it and making a profit. People bought housing with the hope and expectation that they'd be able to sell it for about what they paid for it. And if they put in on, you know, some capital improvements, hopefully get that out. This concept of making a profit off of your house is, I think, I haven't done any research, but a relatively new concept that came in late 60s, 70s. And people think, oh, you got to make money off your house. And I have always thought, well, that's great for rich people, but better to buy your house with the expectation that you will, it's kind of like investing in certificates of deposit instead of in sports bop or whatever that was, stock that went way up, you know, and came down. You know, it's solid. You're gonna get your money back. You don't have to worry about it. And if you want to invest in something else to make money, your affordable housing gives you hopefully some cash that you can invest elsewhere. What are the two most expensive pieces of rental housing or home ownership? Property taxes and mortgage. So to me, nonprofits can do this, but the city, the government can do this even more, which is where you, if the city owns the housing, it's exempt from property taxes. If the county owns the housing, it's exempt from property taxes, assuming it's low-income housing. If the nonprofit, same thing. Property tax exemption is big if you want really low-cost housing. Mortgage financing is also big. The city and the county have authority to do mortgage financing. Nonprofits are great, and they can do this if you have stability in that nonprofit, if you have a board of directors who knows what they're doing. We've seen a lot of nonprofits very recently that used to be going great guns, and the floor fell out from underneath them. And in some cases, they just went under. And with the city government owned housing, you don't have that risk, which is very important. For nonprofits that do this, you just have to make sure that they have a really stable operation to continue to go forward. Otherwise, the mortgage goes into default, you have bankruptcy, and all of that appreciation, all of that asset that's been building up is lost. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox.
Thank you. Do any of our panelists want to respond to those points?
Yeah, I'll chime in a few. Tim, thank you for putting some of those statements out there, and really great pleasure to have you here, being very involved in part of engineering some of these things that we're talking about here. Really appreciate your thoughts and ideas on stability and housing. One of the questions that I have in that particular area that I don't think was well engineered in the whole process is the equity component. The idea of all these things that have been engineered 2 decades ago to stabilize the system and provide affordable or stable housing for the people is looking at the people as customers. What I mean by that, the whole idea looks at the people who really need this housing as renters. And it did not factor in the idea of building equity in wealth for them. All that goes to the developer's end. That's a huge mistake that has been done, which has led to the results that we're getting today. If the city uses tax money to use vehicles like nonprofits or for-profits to build affordable housing, built into that should have a component that builds equity for the people who really are the key to why that service is actually needed. Otherwise, what you end up doing is as the population grows, you get to need more and more resources and funding. In terms of city housing that you also mentioned, I think there are some cases that were tried before this model that also failed. So when you look at Chicago, for example, on the projects, where the city originally started to build houses in the name of the city to cut taxes and all that and make them affordable, what that ended up doing is put a whole bunch of poor people concentrated And what that also does is increase crime. So the real solution cannot be just the city building their own houses together or funneling money through vehicles like nonprofit to for-profit. The real solution involves the community's involvement, where the whole problem is distributed among the community. And again, the key is balance. We have to remember that. The key to solving our problem is finding balance. It's not building too many houses, it's not building too less houses, it's balance. And that's really the sweet spot. And when the city tries to just build too many houses, they would run into what we're realizing right now, then they can never build enough. And when they try to do it by themselves, by building their own properties, then they end up with the same problem again of concentrated poverty and high crime zones. And to capture the real problem, the solution lies in communal effort that involves distributing, having a balanced neighborhood. So we're talking about gentrification, for example, here. What we really want is to have a community that is diverse, that has all kinds of people, all kinds of wealth, single parents, multi-parents, you name it. That diversity is what brings balance. Mom and pop shop, a small flower garden here, a decent development. That is what is balanced to really put us in harmony with our environment. And that is what is lacking. But I think some of the things you mentioned are very key. And but I think the answer ultimately is once we realize the need for balance and we realize the solution lies within a communal effort, then we are at least taking the right step.
Yeah. And we're getting so close. We could talk for another 3 hours, but but we all need to sleep. So Revel, I want to have you speak next, and then also think about like transitioning to kind of any sort of closing statements that our panelists would like to make. And I can't help but throw in something that hasn't been brought up yet, which is the expected storm of evictions, unfortunately, that that may be coming, and how that might play into the housing needs and how we can best meet them.
Yeah, so real quickly, Kava, I just want to push back a little bit on concentration of poverty concept. So I just two things. One, the link between poverty and crime is not so direct. So there's sort of historical examples, Great Depression, for example, in other areas that are high poverty that don't have high crime. Those links aren't so direct. So there are a lot of social explanations for crime that not related to poverty. And I think it's important in the sense of how we approach, poor neighborhoods. And this idea of concentrated poverty is I think is a really seductive idea. I think it offers a lot of sort of explanations, but those explanations I think are really sometimes really troubling when they enter into sort of policy approaches. So one of the things that's happened in housing policy, and I'm glad there's they were sort of talking about the Hope Six and stuff with Bill Clinton, but really going back to those and even previous to this, there's been a real effort to plan for dispersal, which is the idea that how we improve these neighborhoods and actually these people is to disperse them from those neighborhoods. And that is I think a policy that's contributing quite a bit to some of the changes that we're seeing in cities, including the loss of public housing through things like Hope Six, but also the voucher programs and this idea about housing choice. It's again very seductive. People should be able to live where they want and stuff like that. But a lot of research has gone into looking at this, and most of the time, people in low-income neighborhoods they have all kinds of gripes against issues that you mentioned, like high crime or whatnot that they may experience. But oftentimes they want to stay in their neighborhoods, and because their neighborhoods are social, landscapes where you have family members, you have friends, you have services, you have things that you know about, you have information, especially if you're low income or marginalized in any way. Access to information from your circle of friends is extremely important. So it's a lot of planners that have come in and seen these neighborhoods and seen them as the problem, rather than another idea, which is concentrated affluence. So by reframing the problem away from concentrated poverty to concentrated affluence, we flipped the script on this sort of uneven landscape of inequality, where areas that are wealthy are actually the problem. Um, and as we look at sort of densification in the city, one of the things that happens is people who are sitting on very exclusionary subdivisions, where large lot sizes are built in, big setbacks, so people have these big lots. That land value is relative, so that the value of that exclusion is increased by more densification. So people who don't have that room, I mean, that room becomes extremely valuable as we start to sort of densify the city. So, the people who fight affordable housing, people who create all these exclusionary measures, I mean, really, that's the problem. There's a lot of land, there's a lot of room available, and so to focus on poor people as the sort of problem, I think is a little misguided. And so I think it's important that we also, if we are going to talk about concentrated poverty, we also talk about concentrated affluence, and the areas that keep restrictions on poor people moving in as a big part of this issue. As far as concluding comments, I just thank you. This has been a fantastic discussion. And I really have enjoyed meeting all of you and hearing your thoughts, and quite a bit of expertise in now. So, I'm surprised if we can't move the needle on some of these issues, given how much work and experience you all bring to the table. So, if anything, I'm just happy to be here, and I want to thank you all for inviting me to the table.
Thank you. And Olivia, do you want to go next?
Sure. I echo what Revel just said. This has been really fruitful and fun for me. So thank you, and thanks to everyone's thoughts. I guess thinking about the struggle of being a nonprofit, I did want to comment on that. We're not perfect, and the reasons we've struggled or the challenges that we've faced have all been about money and capacity, just to have enough staff to do enough of the things to support our people the way we really should, and to be anti-racist and all of that. And so one thing that our colleagues at Commonwealth Development like to say is that if you're doing affordable housing right, you're losing money, because you have to, it just takes money to support residents, and then also to do the development. And then, there's all these for-profit people and institutions around you that they get paid before the staff get paid at the nonprofit, who are often underpaid, right? So I love my lawyers and my accountants, and we need them, but I get paid way less than they do, right? So that's the struggle part of the nonprofit industrial complex, is there's just, like Rebecca was saying, is the where the money goes is not to us. So yeah, and like Tim said, that stability, organizational stability, is super, super important. And so really what we need is more funding going to these programs that we know are doing good work. And if it can't be public housing because there's federal restrictions on that, then nonprofits, at least we know that private investors and individuals are not profiting from the development, and we're losing money, but that means we need influx of money. The other piece I want to touch on is, I think community control is important. So we have residents on our board who live in our housing, and they are really, really key to making sure we do, make changes or pass policies that work for our residents. And, housing co-ops are often made up of primarily residents on their board. And we don't have any limited equity co-ops in Madison, but they're also a shared equity structure that would touch on what Kaba kept talking about, of building equity while you're living somewhere, while it stays permanently affordable, and would also be community controlled. And then thinking about the eviction crisis, like you asked about, I think we really, really need a right to counsel, and we need to invest in public defense, services for people pre-eviction and during any eviction court, because that is one of the key factors. Once someone is already facing a possible eviction, having that kind of legal help is like one of the key things that can get them out of that situation. Thanks.
Thank you. And Kaba?
Yes, thank you, Diana. Thank you, everybody who have taken time to be here. It's I feel honored to be here with you guys and discussing these topics that are very close to my heart. Lots of new ideas. I've learned a lot myself as well, and I hope we can find ways to keep these kinds of conversations going within us. Like Olivia said, I firmly believe after 12 years of closely looking at the market and looking at what is happening in our town or city, if there is any answer, it has to be involving community. That is a very critical component of it. These problems, we cannot wish them away. We cannot just build them out by building more houses. I just wanted to make one comment about on the concentrated wealth versus concentrated poverty. Revel, I believe you're right that there's not a direct correlation to those two between crime and concentrated poverty. But there's no doubt in my mind that concentrated poverty does not decrease crime. When people are poor, they are more prone to having more problems, particularly in a capitalist system. You can choose exceptions where you have a lot of poverty and no crime, but the fundamental fact in a community that is capital driven, poverty and is at least a contributing factor. It might not be the ultimate and the only, but it's definitely a contributing factor, particularly in a capitalist system. And when we're talking about housing, where capital is involved, it plays a critical part in that, at least in my opinion. But again, that's the beauty of this. We don't have to have the same ideas. We don't have to believe in the same thing, and we don't have to agree on the same thing. We can agree to disagree. The key thing that is important is recognizing that this is going to take a communal effort, for-profit, non-profit, government employees, politicians, developers. It's going to take every bit of us to solve these problems. It's the size of the problem and the complication of it and what is at stake that is so huge that there's no simple magic bullet for it. And with that, I thank you all, and I look forward to participating more and talking with you guys and exchanging ideas as we go. It's great to be in a community like this and sharing ideas with people who are passionate about this as much as I am. Thank you.
Thank you. And Rebecca?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Diane and Matt and Progressive Dane for organizing this, and my co-panelists. It's just been a really engaging and rich discussion. Yeah, on the crime issue, something, was it last summer? I don't even know when it was, but Revel, you made a comment about looking at your eviction data and then looking at patterns of police calls. And you said basically what we have is a police force that is policing a housing crisis. And so much of that is about how we define crime, what we call criminal, what we don't call criminal, and that causes harm. Behavior that we don't call criminal and causes harm, and who gets the police called on them for that. So all of these things are so closely related, and yeah, there are some things, I've mentioned several things that some of us are working on the council, working with the community activists, tenant organizers, folks at the university, folks, in the housing cooperative and community land trust world. We do all have to work together to do what we can. And I believe what Revel said was true. Like Madison, we're at a place historically in time right now, and we have a size of a city where if we organize well enough around these good ideas, to decommodify housing. And I do want to use that in a really intentional way, like, because that is the answer. Decommodifying housing and putting our policies behind the belief that housing is a human right. That is the answer. And if we can organize broadly enough and deeply enough in our community to actually put our collective resources towards doing that, even in a small way, that's going to help. And it will be a model and an object lesson for other communities and for ourselves to maybe do it more broadly. So thanks again, and thanks for everyone who came here and engaged in the chat and listened and learned, and let's do something like this again.
Mark your calendars. We do this each month, although this was I agree with people in the chat, particularly wonderful and rich discussion. So thank you all.
I have like literally